Welcome to the channel. If you're fascinated by real criminal cases, in-depth investigations, and courtroom stories based on verified facts, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. Now, let's begin. February 24th, 2023. Herndon, Virginia. A 911 call breaks the silence of an ordinary Friday morning. When police officers arrived at a quiet suburban home, they discovered a scene that would leave even seasoned investigators stunned. Inside the house lay two bodies. One was Christine Banfield, a wife and the mother of a 4-year-old girl. The other was Joseph Ryan, a man with no known connection to the family. At first glance, it appeared to be a violent home invasion gone terribly wrong. But as detectives began piecing together the evidence, that story started to fall apart. An affair with the family's Brazilian au pair, a secret online profile allegedly created to lure an unsuspecting man, a carefully reconstructed timeline, and a series of decisions that prosecutors would later argue were part of a calculated plan to eliminate a wife without going through a divorce. The defense, however, painted a very different picture, insisting the prosecution's theory relied heavily on the testimony of a woman who had secured a plea agreement in exchange for her cooperation. So what really happened inside that house on the morning of February 24? Was Joseph Ryan simply an innocent man drawn into someone else's deadly plan, or is there still more to this story than the jury ever heard? In today's case, we'll examine the investigation step by step, the forensic evidence, the witness testimony, and the courtroom battle that ultimately led to one of Virginia's most closely watched murder trials. In early 2023, Brendan Banfield lived with his wife, Christine Banfield, and their young daughter in Herndon, a suburban community in Fairfax County, Virginia. The family appeared to lead a stable middle-class life, and they employed a Brazilian au pair, Juliana Perez Magalhães, to help care for their 4-year-old child. At the time, Magalhães was in her early 20s and had been working for the family since 2021. Herndon sits within the Washington metropolitan area, a region known for its quiet residential neighborhoods, commuting professionals, and relatively low rates of violent crime. On the morning of February 24, 2023, emergency responders were called to the Banfield residence after a report of a serious incident inside the home. What began as a local police response would soon draw national attention, as investigators, prosecutors, and defense attorneys presented sharply different interpretations of the events surrounding the deaths of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan. According to prosecutors, the events of February 24, 2023 were not spontaneous, but the final stage of a plan that had been developing for weeks. Prosecutors allege that Brendan Banfield had carefully orchestrated a scenario designed to bring Joseph Ryan into the Banfield home under false pretenses. They argued that Ryan believed he was responding to an online encounter arranged through a profile that had been created to appear as though it belonged to Christine Banfield. During the trial, Juliana Perez Magalhães testified that she and Brendan had used Christine's laptop to create and manage that account, allegedly timing their activity to make it appear as though Christine herself was behind the messages. On the morning of February 24, Magalhães testified that she left the house with the Banfield's 4-year-old daughter while Ryan was expected to arrive. Brendan, she said, waited nearby until receiving a phone call signaling that Ryan had entered the residence. He then returned to the house. Magalhães told the jury that when they went upstairs, Ryan was in the master bedroom with Christine. Moments later, Brendan entered the room. According to her testimony, Christine shouted that Ryan had a knife before Brendan fired his handgun at Ryan. As the confrontation unfolded, Magalhães said Brendan instructed her through hand gestures while she briefly attempted to call 911 before ending the call. She further testified that after leaving the room momentarily to retrieve towels, she returned and saw Brendan attacking Christine with a knife. Later, when Ryan was still showing signs of movement, Magalhães testified that Brendan handed her the handgun and she fired another shot at Ryan. Throughout the trial, prosecutors argued that these actions reflected a deliberate and carefully planned sequence of events. The defense, however, rejected that account, maintaining that Magalhães' testimony was unreliable because it came after she accepted a plea agreement with prosecutors. At approximately 8 a.m., on February 24, 2023, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call from the Banfield residence in Herndon, Virginia. The caller reported that a violent incident had occurred inside the home. Although an initial call had been placed and disconnected, a second call brought first responders to the scene within minutes. When officers entered the residence, they discovered two adults suffering from gunshot wounds. One was Christine Banfield, the homeowner. The other was Joseph Ryan, an unfamiliar man whose presence inside the house immediately raised questions for investigators. Brendan Banfield remained at the residence and spoke with responding officers as they secured the scene. What initially appeared to be an isolated act of violence quickly evolved into a complex homicide investigation, as detectives realized that the circumstances surrounding the deaths were far more complicated than they first appeared. Within minutes of the 911 call, officers from the Fairfax County Police Department arrived at the Banfield residence and immediately secured the property. Following standard emergency protocol, they entered the home to search for survivors, assess potential threats, and preserve the scene for investigators. Medical personnel were allowed inside only after officers confirmed that there was no immediate danger. As officers moved through the residence, they recognized that the scene was far more complex than a routine emergency response. Multiple areas of the home required immediate preservation, prompting officers to establish a secure perimeter and restrict access to anyone not directly involved in the investigation. Detectives from the Major Crimes Bureau and crime scene specialists were requested without delay. Several details immediately stood out to investigators. The presence of two deceased individuals inside the same residence, combined with the condition of the scene and the physical evidence visible upon arrival, indicated that a comprehensive homicide investigation would be necessary. Every room was photographed before any evidence was collected, and officers carefully documented the location of items that could later help reconstruct the sequence of events. From the very beginning, investigators understood that determining exactly what had occurred inside the Banfield home would require far more than witness statements alone. The answers would depend on a meticulous examination of the crime scene itself. Once the residence had been secured, detectives from the Fairfax County Police Department and forensic specialists began a systematic examination of the crime scene. Every room was photographed, measured, and documented before any evidence was collected. Investigators focused on preserving the position of physical evidence, including firearms, spent cartridge casings, bloodstain patterns, fingerprints, and electronic devices that could later help reconstruct the timeline of the incident. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of Virginia conducted autopsies on both victims. According to court records presented during the trial, Christine Banfield died from multiple sharp force injuries, while Joseph Ryan died from gunshot wounds. The medical examiner's findings helped establish the causes of death and provided investigators with an estimated timeline consistent with the morning of February 24, 2023. Crime scene analysts also examined biological evidence, DNA samples, clothing, and trace materials recovered from the residence. Digital evidence, including mobile phones, computers, and online account activity, was preserved for forensic analysis. Prosecutors later argued that this combination of physical and digital evidence supported a deliberate sequence of events, while the defense challenged portions of those interpretations during trial. Ultimately, investigators relied not on a single piece of evidence, but on the totality of the forensic findings, witness testimony, and digital records to build the case presented to the jury. In the hours following the incident, detectives from the Fairfax County Police Department's Major Crimes Bureau began reconstructing the events of the morning using physical evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and witness interviews. Rather than relying on a single account, investigators worked to verify every statement against the evidence collected from the residence. One of the first priorities was determining why Joseph Ryan had entered the Banfield home. Investigators examined his mobile phone, electronic communications, internet activity, and recent movements. Those records led detectives to an online exchange conducted through a profile that appeared to belong to Christine Banfield. As the investigation progressed, forensic analysis of computers and electronic devices became a central focus. According to evidence later presented at trial, investigators concluded that the online profile had not been created or operated by Christine herself. Prosecutors alleged that the account had been established using Christine's laptop and was managed in a way that made it appear she was communicating with Ryan. Digital forensic specialists analyzed login records, timestamps, internet activity, and data recovered from electronic devices to reconstruct when the account had been accessed and from which devices. Detectives also reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses and surrounding neighborhoods to establish the movements of the people involved that morning. Investigators collected available security camera recordings, examined vehicle movements, and compared those findings with phone records and witness statements. Every timeline was tested against digital evidence to determine whether each person's account was consistent with the available facts. At the same time, investigators conducted extensive interviews with family members, neighbors, emergency responders, and anyone who had recent contact with the Banfield household. Detectives sought to understand the relationships between the individuals involved, including the nature of Brendan Banfield's relationship with the family's Brazilian au pair, Juliana Perez Magalhães. Financial records, communication history, and electronic messages were also reviewed to establish possible motives and identify inconsistencies in witness statements. As the investigation continued, detectives compared forensic evidence with the accounts provided by those present at the scene. Every new piece of evidence was evaluated alongside laboratory results, digital analysis, and witness testimony. Rather than focusing on a single clue, investigators gradually assembled a comprehensive timeline that combined physical evidence, electronic data, and interviews. Prosecutors would later argue that these independent sources consistently pointed toward a carefully planned sequence of events, while the defense challenged both the interpretation of the evidence and the conclusions drawn from the digital investigation. By the end of the investigative phase, authorities believed they had gathered sufficient evidence to move the case forward through the criminal justice system. After months of investigative work and consultation with prosecutors, authorities concluded that they had sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. On September 14, 2023, detectives with the Fairfax County Police Department, acting on warrants approved through the court, arrested Brendan Banfield in Fairfax County, Virginia. According to police, the arrest was carried out without incident. Detectives approached Banfield, informed him of the charges, and took him into custody. He did not attempt to flee or physically resist officers during the arrest. Following standard procedure, he was transported to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center, where he was formally booked and held, pending his initial court appearance. Brendan Banfield was charged with multiple felony offenses, including aggravated murder in connection with the deaths of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan, as well as additional charges related to the presence of the Banfield's young daughter inside the home during the incident. Prosecutors alleged that the offenses had been committed as part of a planned scheme, while Banfield, through his attorneys, denied the allegations and entered pleas of not guilty. His arrest marked a significant turning point in the case. With the suspect now in custody, the focus of the investigation shifted from gathering evidence in the field to preparing the case for prosecution. Detectives organized thousands of pages of reports, forensic findings, digital records, and witness statements, while both the prosecution and the defense began preparing for what would become a lengthy and closely watched murder trial in Fairfax County. Following his arrest, Brendan Banfield was questioned by investigators as part of the ongoing homicide investigation. Throughout the proceedings, Banfield maintained that he had not planned the killings and consistently denied the allegations that prosecutors would later present at trial. Rather than admitting involvement in a premeditated plot, he maintained that the events inside the home unfolded unexpectedly. Investigators, however, did not rely solely on direct questioning. They compared Banfield's statements with forensic evidence, digital records, phone data, surveillance footage, and the accounts of other witnesses. During interviews, detectives repeatedly revisited key points in the timeline, asking Banfield to explain specific movements, communications, and decisions made before and after the incident. This technique is commonly used to identify inconsistencies and evaluate whether a subject's account remains consistent when confronted with independently verified evidence. One of the most significant developments came not from Banfield's interview, but from Juliana Perez Magalhães, who later agreed to cooperate with investigators as part of a plea agreement. Her testimony provided prosecutors with a detailed narrative that differed sharply from Banfield's position. The defense, however, argued that her statements should be viewed with caution because they were made after she negotiated reduced charges. As the interviews concluded, investigators continued comparing every statement against the growing body of physical and digital evidence. Rather than relying on any single interview, they built their case by examining whether each account could withstand independent verification. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors assembled a case built on the combined weight of physical evidence, digital forensic analysis, witness testimony, and expert findings, rather than any single piece of evidence. Investigators argued that each category of evidence independently supported the overall timeline they had reconstructed. Crime scene investigators documented and preserved firearms, spent cartridge casings, bloodstain patterns, biological samples, fingerprints, and other trace evidence recovered from the residence. Laboratory testing was conducted on these materials, while forensic specialists examined electronic devices seized during the investigation, including mobile phones, computers, and digital storage media. Investigators also analyzed online account activity, login records, timestamps, and communication histories to determine how certain electronic accounts had been created and accessed. In addition to the forensic evidence, prosecutors relied on surveillance footage, phone records, location data, and witness interviews to corroborate the sequence of events. Records obtained during the investigation were compared with statements made by individuals connected to the case, allowing detectives to evaluate whether the available evidence supported or contradicted those accounts. Expert witnesses later explained many of these technical findings to the jury, particularly those involving digital forensics and crime scene reconstruction. A significant component of the prosecution's case was the cooperation of Juliana Perez Magallanes, whose testimony was considered alongside the physical and digital evidence, rather than in isolation. Prosecutors argued that her account was consistent with multiple categories of independently verified evidence. The defense, however, challenged both the reliability of her testimony and the prosecution's interpretation of several forensic findings, arguing that the evidence did not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After reviewing the investigative file, forensic reports, expert analyses, and supporting documentation, prosecutors concluded that the evidence met the legal standard required to proceed with formal prosecution. The case was then presented before the court, where a jury would ultimately determine the weight and credibility of the evidence introduced at trial. The murder trial of Brendan Banfield began in January 2026 in the Fairfax County Circuit Court, drawing widespread media attention because of its unusual facts and sharply conflicting accounts of what had happened inside the Banfield home. Over several weeks, the jury heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, civilian witnesses, and Juliana Perez Magallanes, whose appearance on the witness stand became one of the most closely watched moments of the trial. During closing arguments, prosecutors told the jury that the evidence revealed a carefully planned scheme motivated by an extramarital relationship, financial concerns, and a desire to avoid divorce. They argued that the events of February 24, 2023 were the result of deliberate planning rather than a spontaneous confrontation. The defense urged jurors to reject that conclusion. Brendan Banfield's attorneys argued that the prosecution's theory depended too heavily on the testimony of Magallanes, who had entered into a plea agreement before testifying. They maintained that her credibility should be viewed with caution and asserted that the prosecution had failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. After deliberating, the jury returned guilty verdicts on the major charges against Brendan Banfield, including the murders of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan. In February 2026, the court formally entered judgments of conviction. Banfield was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional prison terms for the remaining convictions, including offenses involving the presence of the couple's young daughter during the incident. For Christine Banfield's family, the verdict marked the end of a lengthy criminal trial, but not the end of their loss. For the court, the case concluded with a finding that the prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet the proceedings also highlighted the central role that competing narratives and the jury's assessment of credibility played in one of Virginia's most closely followed murder trials. The verdict brought a measure of closure to Christine Banfield's family, who had waited nearly 3 years for the case to reach trial. Although the conviction could never undo their loss, many viewed the jury's decision as an important step toward justice for Christine and for Joseph Ryan, whose family also endured years of unanswered questions. Public reaction was mixed but measured. Many observers believed the verdict reflected the strength of the prosecution's overall case, particularly after weeks of testimony and the presentation of extensive forensic and digital evidence. Others, however, questioned how much weight should have been placed on the testimony of Juliana Perez Magallanes, noting that she testified after accepting a plea agreement. Those concerns became one of the most widely discussed aspects of the trial, especially among legal commentators following the case. Despite those differing opinions, the jury's verdict underscored a fundamental principle of the American justice system. It is the jury, not public opinion, that determines whether the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Long after the trial ended, the Banfield case continued to be discussed as one of Virginia's most complex and closely followed homicide prosecutions, raising difficult questions about trust, manipulation, and the consequences of deception. Now we'd like to hear your perspective. After listening to the evidence presented in court, the testimony from both sides, and the jury's verdict, do you believe justice was served in this case? Was the evidence strong enough to support the convictions beyond a reasonable doubt? Or do you think there are still unanswered questions that deserve closer examination? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Every opinion is welcome, as long as the discussion remains thoughtful and respectful to the victims, their families, and everyone affected by this tragic case. Cases like this remind us that the most devastating acts of violence do not always begin with rage or chaos. Sometimes, they begin quietly, with secrets, deception, and choices that grow more dangerous each time the truth is avoided. Whether viewed through the prosecution's theory or the defense's arguments, one fact remains unchanged. Multiple lives were permanently shattered, and a young child lost both the safety of her home and the future she should have had with her family. This case also demonstrates how modern criminal investigations extend far beyond eyewitness accounts. Digital footprints, electronic communications, surveillance footage, and forensic science now play an increasingly important role in uncovering the truth. In today's world, even the smallest decision, an online message, a deleted file, a location record, or a timestamp, can become a critical piece of evidence when investigators reconstruct the events surrounding a crime. At the same time, the trial illustrates another important principle. In the American justice system, guilt is determined in a courtroom, not on social media or in public opinion. Jurors are asked to weigh competing narratives, examine the credibility of witnesses, and evaluate whether the evidence meets the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That responsibility is both difficult and essential, especially in cases where emotions run high and public attention is intense. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of this case is not only the loss of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan, but the lasting impact left on everyone connected to them. Families must carry grief that cannot be measured by a verdict, while a child grows up with memories forever shaped by a single morning that changed everything. No court can restore the lives that were lost, and no sentence can erase the pain left behind. What remains is a reminder that trust, once replaced by deception, can set in motion consequences that no one can reverse. Behind every headline, every courtroom argument, and every legal document are real people whose lives will never be the same. And long after the trial has ended, that may be the part of this story that matters most. If you found this case informative and want to follow more real criminal investigations, courtroom trials, and unsolved mysteries, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Every sunset brings the promise of a new dawn. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.